Hi, thanks again for joining me, Gary Zacharias with the Apologist Bookshelf. This will be the fifth podcast in which I am covering a book called Confident Faith. We've run through all these different faith paths, he calls them. I guess we would think of them as worldviews, but different ways that people try to come to some religious faith, some of their beliefs. And so he's gone through 6 faith paths. One's relativistic, then there's the traditional, authoritarian, intuitive, mystical, and finally evidential. And of course, that's the Christian one that he thinks is the correct one. But he's got a section then before he launches into the second part of his book, and it's kind of a summary, I guess you'd say, of all those 6 faith paths. And I'd like to go through those today. And you know what I'm doing is running through the entire book here, which is different than what I've done in the past in these podcasts. And I hope you like it okay. And in fact, if you like these better, I can certainly go book by book. But I just thought it was kind of fun to give you a flavor of a lot of different books as we would go through a chapter from each of them. All right, so here he's going to do a review of those 6 faith paths. He said interacting with them is really central to trying to find a confident faith, which is, of course, the title of his book. So he said he's going to do them backwards. So he's going to start with the one that he talked about last, which is the evidential faith path. And he says that really is a good way to test all the other worldviews. Its key elements, he said, are logic and sensory experience. He said those are God-given tools. He said we get most of our information from them. They're really the best way. They're our best resources to examine truth claims to see what we ought to believe. He said, well, wait a minute. He said there are going to be some Christians who would say, well, God's revelation has to be primary. So that's what you got to start with. But he said, there are a lot of holy books out there that talk about this is God's revelation. He said, we've got to put them to the test. How do we know which one is actual inspired scripture? So he says, here's the order that he thinks can lead to a more confident faith. 1, use logic, use evidence to test these truth claims, especially the Bible. Is it really God's revelation? And then secondly, discover that the Bible alone passes these tests of truth and you accept it as the authority of your life. And it says, including receiving the Savior it presents. And then third, using those teachings of the Bible to measure and test all these other truth claims. So he says, there's your order. Use logic and evidence first to decide, okay, which of these holy books do I trust? Which of these worldviews make sense to me? Then you say, well, the Bible passes the test of truth. You accept it, and then you judge the other faith paths. So I think that makes sense. So let's go through the other faith paths that he looks at. After the evidential one, then he said, what about the mystical one? He said, it can be powerful. He said, there are times God does use direct ways to communicate. In fact, in the chapter that simply covered the mystical faith path, he talks about Paul being talked to by God directly. He talks about St. Augustine. He talks about Blaise Pascal. So he gives some stories. He said, yeah, God sometimes uses direct ways to communicate to us, but here's the problem. It can be misleading. Sometimes we mistake just our feelings as if it's a spiritual reality, or, and this is the dangerous part, you misidentify a real spiritual entity as being good and from God, but it may not be. So he said we need discernment as well as just the willingness to stop and examine what we've experienced. So just because we've experienced it doesn't mean that it's the authentic thing we should be following. So he said we should question everything. So he says, look in the Bible, it says, dear friends, don't believe everyone who claims to speak by the Spirit. You must test them to see if the Spirit they have comes from God, for there are many false prophets in the world. So there's the danger of the mystical faith path. You can be led astray pretty easily. Then there's another one called the intuitive faith path. He says, again, that's where you're kind of going by hunches and instincts. You'd call it your gut reaction, your gut feelings. He says, caution, wait, time out. You don't want to heed your hunches in isolation apart from any other criteria. So he said, beware. Okay, so you may get a flashing light, it says beware, but you got to look into the matter. He said, you may get a hunch, you may get a feeling, and that's good. It calls your attention to danger, maybe even opportunity. So heed those promptings, but then look into the reasons behind what you're sensing. Look for the supporting evidence. Let your gut feelings confirm what you find, but don't let them lead you into a blind alley. Get clearer, more complete information, and ask God for guidance along the way. Then there's the authoritarian faith path. He said, okay, so we all have authority figures in our lives. He said, it requires courage for us to examine the qualifications of these people and their ideas. He said, but we've got to. We've got to examine them. He said, authorities who tell us these traditional things often contradict each other, so they can't all be correct. He says, if you're under a spiritual authority that tries to do all your thinking for you, he said, maybe you should step back and start thinking for yourself. Apply logic, apply evidence to decide whether you really want to let that person or organization keep leading you. He said, be humble about this. Quietly, he says, and prayerfully begin to examine the evidence that supports the beliefs that you've been handed, right? There's an authoritarian figure who says, here's what you ought to believe. He says, don't settle for simple answers or just cave into authoritarian pressures to conform. Boy, I think that's great advice. He says, Jesus said this, keep on asking and you'll receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking and you will find. Keep on knocking and the door will be open to you. He also said, Jesus again, also said, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? I think about our society today. People are not finding truth. They're not even seeking for truth. They're just seeking for something that makes them feel good, and they're not free. It's really ironic to me that people rush off from the Bible, or they rush away from Christianity because they say they want freedom. And what do they end up? They end up enslaved to something. Maybe it's a drug, maybe it's a person of authority, but they end up enslaved. Really sad. Here's another traditional faith path called the traditional one. He said that approach is pretty passive. You just rely on hand-me-down beliefs or habits, and you just, your mom and dad or your relatives or the culture you live in. He said, okay, he said they could be right, but they could be wrong too, and you don't know until you back up and look into the logic and the evidence. So can you see again what he's trying to say here? We come back all the time to logic and evidence, which is the Christian challenge to us. He says, let's do that if we've been involved in the traditional faith path. He said, hey, here's a problem, of course. These different traditions that we hear contradict each other, so they can't all be correct. So we've got to stop and look at them a little bit more deeply. We don't want to just carry on a tradition. Now, he said, and then if you've really examined something, then you can confidently embrace the belief and pass it along to the next generation. That's what we've tried to do with our kids and grandkids, to say, examine it. Is it real? Who wants to believe it? If it's not true, who wants to go along with it? Well, we got better things to do with our lives. So we do our due diligence and examine the faith and find out if it's based on truth. And then you can embrace it. All right, then there's the relativistic faith path. That's the one he talked about pretty early in the book. He said, it's not hard to imagine that this mind over matter, just how you feel about it, methodology would lead someone to ignore uncomfortable information, just pick ideas that seem desirable to them. So if what works is to think that you're your own God, like the New Age people tell us, or if what fits is to decide morality is just a byproduct of our culture, then why not just do whatever feels right? Well, that's what you hear a lot with this relativistic faith path. I think about the book The Secret by Rhonda Byrne. It's all about you're your own God, you create your own reality, you bring it into existence, you think about it, you follow your own heart. He says, but where does this approach take us? It promises to take us any place we want to go, at least in our own mind, but you may not like the outcome. He says it's kind of like a person who gets a bad report back from the lab but doesn't want to believe the cancer's there, and he forgoes treatment. He says it's better to deal with the real truth. So his encouragement is to step off the path and search for real truth, not just what makes you feel good. Okay, so I'm skipping over a part of the book here. What I'd like to do just in the last few minutes is he has the next section of the book, and it's called, I like this, it's called 20 Arrows of Truth. So, in other words, reasons you can be confident that the Christian faith is true. If you notice, up till now, he's just pointed out problems with other faith paths, other worldviews, and now he's going to try to give us reasons, 20 reasons, he calls them arrows of truth, to point to the Christian faith path as being true. So what we're going to get here, what he does, and I think it's a good way to do it, he says he's going to build a cumulative case. So, in other words, if you're in a court of law, let's say, and somebody was on trial, and the lawyer who is trying to accuse them and bring a conviction lays out two pieces of evidence, that's not really very good, is it? I mean, can you imagine it'd be easy to maybe pull those two apart? But what if the prosecutor had, let's say, 10 or 15 or even 20, things like DNA and photography and eyewitnesses and police reports and videos, and I mean, just all sorts of stuff. If he's got more evidence, if he can pile up the evidence, it's more likely you're going to get a conviction. So he says he's going to present 20 arguments that he thinks will direct us to spiritual truth. And he said, now, not every argument is going to be equally compelling to every reader, but he's going to build a cumulative case. In other words, it's pretty hard. You're going to get overwhelmed by an avalanche of 20 reasons. So he says they all are arrows, are pointing in a particular way. So I'll just do the first one now, just because of time here. But here's arrow number 1, design in the universe. Where's that arrow point? An intelligent designer. He said we can go clear back to a man named William Paley, who wrote a book, Natural Theology, in 1802. And Paley had an argument that still holds true today. He said if you find a watch on the ground, you pick it up, you look at it, you go, this is not a fluke of nature. This is not a case of wind and erosion and water coming through and things like that. No, you got to watch. If you look at it, you open it up and you see all these little gears and mechanisms. They're complex and they're obviously designed. That requires a watchmaker. So he says if something shows evidence, he, meaning Paley, he said when something shows evidence of having been made for a purpose, it points all of us back to a purposeful cause, an intelligent designer. And he said it's still true today. So Mittelberg says nobody picks up a watch on the beach and says, oh, praise the cosmos. Look at this creation that the forces of chance have tossed together. No. Says if you think a watch needs a designer, move from the watch to look at your hand. It's way more complex, has more moving parts, has more of an intricate design. That needs a designer even far more than that watch did. So he said, here's a description from Michael Denton. He's an Australian molecular biologist. So I want you to, this is a longer quote, but it's really, really good. And so bear with me because I usually don't do long quotations. But here's Denton. Remember, we're talking about design in the universe. Here's what Denton had to say. Perhaps in no other area of modern biology, remember this person is an Australian molecular biologist. So he says, in no other area of modern biology is the challenge posed by the extreme complexity and ingenuity of biological adaptations more apparent than in the fascinating new molecular world of the cell. So he said, let's imagine, we're going to magnify that cell 1,000 million times. He said until that cell is 20 kilometers in diameter, that's 12 miles. So he said, can you imagine one cell 12 miles around? He said, let's take a look at it. Now here's what he has to say. He says, we would see an object of unparalleled complexity and adaptive design. On the surface, we would see millions of openings like portholes of a vast spaceship. They're opening, they're closing to allow a continual stream of material to flow in and out. He said, so now let's go inside it. And he said it's more supreme technology and bewildering complexity inside. And then he asked the question, is it really credible that random processes could have constructed this reality? He said, it's unbelievable. So back to Mittelberg, he said, I don't know what's more astounding, the design when you look down through a telescope or a design when you look down through a microscope or you look up through a telescope. So he said, we see this beauty and order and grandeur of the universe. Like David, the psalm writer, he said, the heavens proclaim the glory of God. The skies display his craftsmanship. And even Paul picked up on that later, and he said, ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature. They have no excuse for not knowing God. So he said, well, back to Mittelberg now, he says, now you get somebody who comes along like a David Hume, Richard Dawkins. So atheists say, well, wait a minute. You got this designer hypothesis, but then, I'll catch you here on this one, who designed the designer? So he says, at best, design just points to a finite designer, not an infinite deity. So Mittelberg says, well, let's take that issue on about who designed the designer. So he said, number one, he says, even if the existence of a finite designer was all you could deduce, he said, I don't think that's the case, but unbelievable, that designer would have to be extremely old, incredibly intelligent, amazingly powerful, and wonderfully wise to design this universe. How about number two? We shouldn't stop with the existence of a finite designer if that's all we can deduce at first. It says, shouldn't we take another step? It says, yeah, if there's a finite designer, then who designed and made him? It says that must be even more mind-boggling. And if that designer is limited in any way, we can only imagine who made him. So he said, if we keep this track going back as far as possible, we're rapidly approaching what? An eternal, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent God. The argument from design eventually takes us back to an infinite designer. He said it'll probably end up being a lot like the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob described in the Bible. I think that's true. Then he says a third thing we can think of. Who designed the designer? Well, what if this intelligent designer went to the effort of telling us what he's like in other ways besides the clues of nature? What if he spoke through people? And what if he wrote a book about it all? So he said that the evidence from design leads us to at least consider potential information from Revelation, which we get in the Bible. All right, so I think I will stop there. That's arrow number one. Find the design in the universe and design in us. Oh, man, amazing. So science, I think, is actually starting to point to a God as opposed to away from a God. So that's arrow number one, coming from Mark Mittelberg in his book, Confident Faith. And we'll explore some of these other arrows later in the next podcast. And again, if you like what I'm doing, which is going through an entire book, giving you a feeling of completeness rather than bits and pieces that I've been doing, let me know. I'll be glad to change. I'm having fun going through different books, though, to give you kind of a quick view of a lot of them in case you go, well, I wouldn't mind looking at that, or maybe I'll pick up this one later. Anyway, so that's Confident Faith, Mark Mittelberg, and we'll pick up some of those other arrows in the next podcast. Thank you, and hope you're having a good day.